Okay, we're back, and we're going to be talking in Chapter 6 about predictors. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about selecting potential employees and different kinds of predictors that we can use for helping us to determine whether a candidate is a good fit for a job. So, the role of predictors. So, when we're trying to select a new employee, we don't have access to the actual criteria that we might be interested in. We don't really have access to information about how conscientious this person really is. We don't really have direct access to how intelligent they are. These are things that are abstract concepts. They are things that maybe could be displayed over time through, a series of behaviors. But in the selection process, we just don't have direct access to these to the kinds of information that would allow us to know for certain how conscientious or how intelligent or how open to experience an individual really is. So we're going to use predictors. These are going to be substitutes for the criteria. So for example, if we're interested in the conscientiousness of an employee, we might administer the Big Five inventory, which has a sub-scale that measures conscientiousness. So this inventory is going to provide a number that's going to serve as a stand-in for the concept of conscientiousness. Or we might be interested in how intelligent a person might be. So we might administer an IQ test, Stanford-Binet or something like that, Wonderlic, and let that number serve as a stand-in for this abstract concept of intelligence. We're going to use these predictors to forecast the likelihood that this person that we're assessing actually will display these qualities on the job, right? So we're going to administer a Big Five inventory. The person scores in the conscientiousness range that we're looking for, and we're going to predict, we're going to forecast that this person's going to display the kinds of behaviors that we want to see on the job. So you can see a couple of error opportunities, can't you? First off, we might be looking for the wrong criteria. Like maybe we think conscientiousness is really important for, the kind of performance we want to see on the job, and it turns out that that's not even relevant. So we might be looking at the wrong criteria from the get-go. We might use the wrong kind of predictor for assessing that criterion. Or we might use the information from that predictor incorrectly when we attempt to make our forecast. So you can see how this is sort of a risky undertaking, trying to predict how a person's actually going to behave on the job. Nevertheless, we're going to try. So the word test refers to a systematic procedure for observing behavior. So there are lots of different kinds of tests, different styles of tests, different ways that we could test behavior, right? They are just, when we say we're going to administer a test, it just means that we're going to use some kind of system to make sure that our observations are consistent across individuals. A lot of times these tests are going to use numbers to describe performance. So a high score means this and a low score means that. Or we might have fixed categories where you score in the introverted category or the extroverted category, not with a number attached, but just you are in this category or that category. So it could be numbers, it could be fixed categories. Now, when we say systematic, it means that we're going to be administering the test in the same way across groups of people, so that we have a little bit of confidence that the test is at least consistent across people. Whenever we use the word test, you can think about it synonymously as a predictor. So on the previous slide, we talked about predictors. Here I'm talking about tests. We're going to use the test as a predictor. As I promised previously, I will manage to weasel job analysis into everything, because especially here on the industrial side of IO psychology, job analysis is critical, right? So we're going to use job analysis to identify the criteria that we think might be important for performance on the job. And then we're going to need to locate a good predictor that'll fit and that will, help us to identify that criteria. We might have to develop or create our own predictor from the ground up, or we might be able to find a predictor that's pretty good and we just have to modify it a little bit. So I would like to argue that the first goal should be to locate an existing predictor. The second goal would be, well, if I can't find one that's perfect, maybe I can just modify it a little bit. The last ditch effort should be developing or creating one's own predictors, because that is a really complex undertaking. Those of you who have taken tests and measurements can attest that, trying to create a new test is a really painstaking and time-consuming job. It's not something that you can just whip out and let's go use this test. You have to make sure that it's actually systematic and that it's actually allowing us to gain insight into the behavior. We have to come up with some kind of numerical scale or fixed category that it's going to be providing at the end. So it's really time consuming. And so we want to either locate or modify a predictor as often as we can, and really save developing or creating for like really big jobs or really novel approaches that need to be done, and it's worth the effort. Now, in my effort to reassure you that you should always locate or modify an existing predictor, I wanted to introduce you to something that you might not have heard of before that is called the Mental Measurements Yearbook. Unfortunately, Eastern doesn't subscribe to the associated database for this, but we do have the hard copy yearbooks. And what the Mental Measurements Yearbook contains is all the tests in print, basically. And in fact, Mental Measurements Yearbook and Tests in Print have joined forces and have made one big database that is searchable and things like that. But like I said, we don't subscribe to it at Eastern. I thought I found another school in the state that subscribed to it. Green River Community College was on the list of members, but it looks like they've let it lapse also, which is kind of unfortunate because being able to search in an electronic database is a huge advantage. But you can go into the library, they have the hard copy of it, and you can look for tests that are supposed to measure different kinds of criteria. So they have personality criteria, or they have intelligence criteria, or they have disordered criteria, different kinds of things that you can look for. And it's one big compendium of different mental measurements, basically. One of the most disappointing parts about the Mental Measurements Yearbook is it lists everything. And so there are tests and measures that are listed in there that are they're pay types of measurements, like you need to subscribe to it, or you have to buy it. And some tests are really expensive, like hundreds of dollars to get 50 tests, something like that. We had a big crisis in the department because we had an intelligence test that we owned, and somebody had it in their car and it got stolen, and it's like thousands of dollars that we just lost through that, because these tests oftentimes are for pay. But the Mental Measurements Yearbook also includes information about ones that were published out in journals and things where you can get it for free. So a lot of times there's an alternative. You may not be able to get like the standardized IQ test, but you'd be able to get something that could measure cognitive ability, and it would be free. All right. So that's my sales pitch for, locating and modifying before thinking about creating or developing. All right. So when we are deciding which tests we might need to administer, we want to link job analysis to specific measures of the case house, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other. So job analysis is going to lead to those job specifications, and we remember that. And then those job specifications are going to help us to determine what the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities are that we need in our candidates. Under knowledge, we've got advanced knowledge in a specific discipline or advanced knowledge in broader domains. And we might be able to measure those things with biodata, right? Like we might just ask them about the courses they've taken or the courses that they've taught or research experiences. Like that could be on their resume or their vita. We might assume advanced knowledge in broader domains because of advanced degrees, and that would reveal itself on a biodata sheet, right, where the person lists their biographical data. Now, under advanced knowledge in a specific discipline, we might want to administer some kind of test that assesses specific cognitive ability. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Under the advanced knowledge in broader domains, we might want to administer a test that would assess general cognitive ability. So we'll get into the distinction between those two things in a little bit. Under skills, we have, I don't know if you guys can tell, but we're looking at the job analysis case-aus for university professor. So research skills, again, maybe we'd be able to infer that from their publication record, and that would appear on their biodata, their vita. Maybe their advising skills. So maybe we have certain personality characteristics that we think go along with being a good advisor. And so maybe we could administer a personality test. Maybe we could find out about their advising skills through the interview process. So there's different ways that maybe we could assess certain of these skills. And then under abilities, we have, again, some information that could be drawn from a biodata sheet. Maybe we could give them a work sample. I'll give you an example what that is later. Maybe we could find out more information about their communication ability through the interview process, like how do they speak, things like that. Maybe we'll ask them to do a work sample. We'll have them teach a sample class or something so we can see what their communication style is, right? So you can kind of imagine for this job of university professor that we might have some information that's just fact, and they can provide that to us on their biodata sheet. Others, you can imagine that we want them to show us in a work sample or in an interview. And then other things that maybe we could administer a test and we could find out the answer through that. So we want to be kind of flexible as we think of ways that we could assess the case-aus for a particular job category. So I wanted to use a job category that is, I don't know if you can get a lot farther away from the case-aus of a professor and then the case-aus of an automotive body and related repairers. So I linked this in the classroom. Normally in a face-to-face class, I would pass this out as a piece of paper. Well, I think it's got 2 pages, so front and back of a paper. And I got this off of ONET, summary report for automotive body. I keep calling it automotive body. Automotive body and related repairs. And the quick definition: repair and refinish automotive vehicle bodies and straighten vehicle frames. Okay, so knowledge. So we have mechanical, English language, customer and personal service, production and processing, public safety and security listed under knowledge that we would expect for a person who's going to do this job. Skills, we need repairing skills, active listening skills, complex problem solving, monitoring, operation and control, speaking. And then under abilities, we've got oral comprehension, information ordering, manual dexterity, near vision, category flexibility, control precision, oral expression, trunk strength, which is referring to the person's body, not to the trunk of the car, visualization, arm-hand steadiness, depth perception, far vision, finger dexterity, multi-limb coordination, problem sensitivity, speech recognition, static strength, and visual color discrimination. I copied this directly off of ONET in case you're wondering, and you'll notice there were 4 different things that had to do with vision, right? So it feels like it wouldn't kill ONET to maybe gather things together that are related, right? So we could see near vision and far vision together next to depth perception and visual color discrimination. Like those maybe all could be under maybe even a category called vision. But it's up to a person who's trying to develop a test to be able to go through that list, figure out what's more important, what's less important, things like that. So that's our little demo. We're going to come back to that in a little bit of detail in a little bit of time. All right, classification of tests. So there are today computer adaptive testing tests that are available for a lot of different subjects. I use them in my introductory psychology class and my Psych 200 class. And actually Abnormal Psych also, this one publisher, well, a lot of publishers have now created these adaptive tests. What's really neat about adaptive testing is that your score on earlier questions affects the difficulty of the later questions. So if you really seem to understand the material, you hop up to the harder questions faster. So we can waste a little less time with you going through every single item on the test. We can kind of skip over, okay, clearly you know this more rudimentary stuff. Let's get to a little more complex stuff. So adaptive quizzing is kind of efficient that way. We can get right to what you really know. Those of you who went to community college before university might remember taking the Compass test, which is a computer administered test, and it is to place you in your English class and your math class. And it's an adaptive test. And what it does is sort of the reverse of what I was just describing. It looks for your first mistake, and then you get kicked over into a different category of questions to figure out, like really drill down where your misunderstandings are and things like that. So one of the things I always encourage people when I was teaching community college, if they did poorly on the Compass test, I would tell them, look at your readout, see where you got placed, and that's a good indicator of where you made a mistake. Go back and study up a little bit on that area and take the test again. And I had students who would be advanced 1 or 2 classes as a function of retaking the test with a mindset towards not making that same mistake again. Because the adaptive quizzes can really kick you into, well, obviously you don't know this, and they'll put you into another category where it's like, if you had just given me one more question on that topic, I might have noticed my mistake and done it correctly on the second one. But adaptive quizzing, oftentimes it just skips to the category where it thinks you belong. So it's got that benefit where we can save a lot of time, especially in those people who do know more and they can kind of hop ahead. But you can also imagine getting harmed by it. It is quick and accurate. So we do like that anytime we're administering tests with computers, it's an advantage. If time is money, it's going to be an advantage to do it on a computer. And it may be more precise than other kinds of tests because of that flexibility that the computer shows with, tailoring the questions to your understanding. Then there is another category of tests called speed versus power. So a speed test, I'm giving the example of data entry. So let's say that you're trying for a job as a data entry technician, and you're given a list of items on a piece of paper, and you're supposed to, as quickly as you can, enter those pieces of data into a data entry form, right? So you have to, tab over to the different squares, and you have to type correctly and like that. Usually with a speed test, they're going to give you a limited time, usually a pretty short amount of time, like maybe a minute. And your score is going to be how many items you actually got through. So they're going to be a little bit less concerned about accuracy and a lot more concerned about like speed. But of course you want to have, if you're really super fast, but every single thing is wrong, that's going to harm your score, obviously. A power test would be staying in that same data related example. In this case, instead of entering data, we're going to ask you to analyze data. And so this is going to be a much more complex and difficult set of questions. So maybe you're provided with a spreadsheet of numbers, and you're supposed to, find all the averages, or you're supposed to compute t-tests on them, or you're supposed to look for patterns. You're supposed to create a graph. I mean, those kinds of things. So it's more complex than a speed test. Usually you're given more time. It's not necessarily the case that you're always going to have like 1 minute and get as much as you can. Instead, we're going to be looking at how much you got done correctly. We're going to be really interested in accuracy in the power test. So power tests are usually more complex. Another classification is whether we're administering the test individually or in a group. Individual tests are a lot more costly, right? That would be where the individual who's being tested is by themselves, maybe with the test administrator, like certain intelligence tests like the Stanford Binet or the Wechsler tests. They're administered one-on-one with a test administrator, not only, recording answers and stuff, but really asking follow-up probe questions and things to make sure that the person is getting, really understanding the question and getting the best chance to show their understanding or knowledge. Or intelligence. And so they're very costly, right? Because you have to have this trained individual with the one person who's taking the test, and it takes more time. It takes, you have to pay for all of these things. And so individual tests are fairly uncommon in employment selection. There are circumstances where they make a lot of sense. When it is individual tests, a lot of times it's a computer adaptive testing situation, so that you can have it being, I can skip ahead and I can have the computer score it. So while it took some time, it didn't involve a paid person sitting there and interacting with you. So we could save a little bit of money like that. Group tests are much more common and they are more cost effective, right? So I've got a nice picture there of like a bunch of people all taking the same test. It's probably an SAT or something, but you can imagine that for employment also, where maybe we're having a big job fair and we have, 50 people who all sit down at one time and take one of our screening tests. And, you don't even get to talk to one of our, hiring advisors or whatever, unless you've got the score we need you to have on this test that you took. Now, one of the problems with administering tests live at all is that now you got to score these tests, right? Like somebody has to sit down and look at the answers, sum up the scores, things like that. And so it's more time consuming than a computer administered test all the time. It's always going to be more. Whether it's an individual or a group test, there's going to be that cost at the end where you have to actually score everything. Paper and pencil versus performance tests. So you can see that there's a lot of interlinking among these categories, right? Because you could see where a paper and pencil test could be maybe administered as a group test, and it could be, let's say, a speed test. So you could see how a lot of these things could be linked together. Paper and pencil tests, a lot of times we're going to use paper and pencil tests to assess some kind of trait or quality, like cognitive ability or conscientiousness or something like that. There are different ways that these tests can be set up, and you guys are probably familiar with the, different ways that psychologists can set up questionnaires, and you can have open-ended essay items, or you can have multiple choice items, and the multiple choice, by the way, would include like a Likert type scale where you give an answer that's on a scale from 1 to 7 or something like that. We consider that a multiple choice test. True, false, you're either agreeing or disagreeing, or, you're answering a question and you are saying that that's a true statement or a false statement. Yes, no, stuff like that. And then finally we have short answer where maybe you're going to give a sentence in response, or maybe a couple of words in response. Paper and pencil tests are attractive. Psychologists like them a lot, where it's something we've been doing for, 120 years at this point. We really like a good paper and pencil test. They tend to be pretty quick because we can oftentimes develop tests that have, 25 questions, and they really can give us good insight into some characteristic or quality. Typically they have very, especially the multiple choice and true false items will have very specific, easy to score, rubrics where it's very easy to do it. The essay and the short answer can be a little trickier because people might use slightly different wording to convey the same idea. So those can be a little bit more complex, but still a little bit easier than some ways of assessing these qualities. So we still consider, even with the essays and the short answer, they fall under the quick and accurate scoring idea. The performance tests would be when we actually ask you to do something, right? So maybe in my example with data analysis, I might ask you to actually, enter the data into SPSS, and then I ask you to run a one-way analysis of variance with post hoc analyses, and right, like, so I ask you for a certain thing, and then your job is to show that you understand SPSS by actually doing the things I asked you to do. Like, you're showing me how this software works and your knowledge of this software by doing the things I asked you to do and doing them correctly. You can imagine performance tests being administered for, let's say, maybe you're wanting to be a waiter or waitress, and your employer wants to see you actually carrying the dishes. If you're at a diner, maybe we want to see you be able to carry the dishes up your arm. Or if you're working at a restaurant that uses trays, like, do you know how to stack the full dishes of food onto this tray in a way so that the bottoms of the plates aren't touching each other's food, and it's all stable. So when you carry it, like, I used to be a waiter. I used to be a waitress, first at a diner and then at a place that had trays. And I literally had to do a performance test at both places. I had to show that I could carry, I think I was required to carry 6 items at the diner with no tray. I had to carry 3 plates, a bowl of like gravy, that was a side. I had to carry 2 drink glasses, like all at the same time in the performance test. And then when I got hired at a Mexican food restaurant that was such a step up, I had to do it on a tray. And I'm like, oh crap, I've never really done a tray, but I apparently stacked it correctly because I got hired. But they wanted to make sure that you weren't going to be dumping trays of food or getting the bottom of plates into people's dinners and, your fingers into it and stuff like that. So you had to take this performance test. So you can imagine how useful that would be for certain kinds of, manual jobs, things where you actually are using your body, or, if you're trying out to be a surgeon, you might have to do a demonstration on either a computer simulation or a cadaver or something like that. You can imagine where you could see certain kinds of jobs needing, a demonstration of skill. So these are our classifications. These are the different ways that we can administer tests. Like I said, you can see that there could be a lot of different kinds of overlaps, right? Like maybe we could do a performance test. All of you who were considering hiring to be a waiter or waitress, here are the plates you have to pick up, right? You can imagine doing it as a group. You can imagine doing it as an individual. You can, there are lots of different ways that we could set these kinds of things up. All right. So I'm going to stop here. And in the next segment, we'll just start going through the different kinds of things that we can assess with tests. So I will see you back in the next segment.